Hello and welcome to episode 15 of the House Detective Diaries. I'm Marianne Taylor, aka the House Detective, and I'll be taking you through my top 5 interesting finds from my house history research over the past couple of weeks. I'll be telling you about this cool old photo I found and having a look at what you can see in the background. I'm going to reveal what cool things a friend of mine found under their lino when they were renovating their house. I'll be talking about a remarkable company that was established in 1919 to service rural areas. I'm going to finish off the story of the James Street house that I began in last episode and tell you a little bit about the house that used to be on the block of land at Moorooka where it was moved to and what happened to it. Finally, I'm going to share the history of an incredible medical facility at Stanthorpe that I uncovered during some of my research. I hope you enjoy watching. First up, this wonderful photo. I stumbled across this on the State Library of Queensland website when I was trying to find some photographs of backyards. And this was one that I came across and I thought it was such a remarkable photo because first of all, it is obviously people working the land and you don't often get photos of them. And secondly, it captures so much about their life in this one photograph, and it shows parts of the house that normally wouldn't be captured in a photo either. So I thought I would take you through some of that. Now, part of why I love this photograph is that you rarely see photos like this that capture people relaxing in the backyard of a farm or a homestead like this. Generally, photos from that time were people posed formally, or they were lined up on their front veranda in front of the house. They were showing off how wealthy they were to friends back home by having the horses and carts in with them. This is basically a relaxed family snapshot. Now, the caption of the photo simply says backyard at Pine Creek. But when you go in to look at the catalogue record with the State Library of Queensland, there's a little bit more information, and it says that it was actually Atkin Jerome Rohr's farm. I have no idea how to pronounce that. His surname was R-O-H-R, so if you can leave a comment below how that's pronounced, I'd be very grateful. I don't even know what nationality that is. Atkin Jerome Rohr's farm, and it was built at Pine Creek, which is near Canungra, which is in the Gold Coast hinterland, just sort of south of Tamborine Mountain. And it was built in 1885 according to this description. But the thing I love most about this photo is that the family pets have made an appearance. So there's the pet dog, there's the lady on the right has a bird in a cage, and then there's also the chooks and I think some ducks there as well. So it really shows this kind of, menagerie of animals that they had on this property at that time. Other interesting items in the background that you can see is on the right hand side there's a cubic cast iron water tank, and on the right of that there's a more common corrugated iron style water tank. Now, of course, back in the day in this area there would have been no town water, so you had to live off rainwater that was captured in tanks like these. There's also some great, what appear to be galvanised iron containers lying around. Of course, there was no such thing as plastic back in these times, so everything was either metal or wood. You can even see under the cast iron tank what was possibly their bathtub. So these tins would often be dragged in front of the fire in the kitchen and filled with warm water if you were super fancy, or cold water if you weren't. And the whole family would basically bathe out of that one bath full of water. It seems a little bit unhygienic by our standards, but when you are getting your water from the rain tank and there's limited supply, then you had to conserve what you could. Now, the guy on the left appears to be holding what looks like a sieve. If you've ever watched archaeological digs on TV like Time Team, or if you've ever been part of one, then sieves like this are used to process the dirt that's excavated from diggings, and the smaller stuff falls through while bigger stuff is captured in the top. Now, I'm not too sure why he would have a sieve. It seems like a very unusual way to sort of try and find gold or something like that. But there also seems to be another one hanging on the wall behind him, which is curious. He also sort of looks like he's feeding the chooks out of it, so maybe I've got it entirely wrong and it's something else. If you know what they actually are, please comment below, I'd love to know. Ditto for what looks like a timber barrel on the veranda behind them on the right hand side. Now my gut feeling would be that this is some kind of butter churn perhaps, but it's really large, so I'm not entirely sure. And again, if anyone knows what this is, please let me know in the comments below. It would be great to find out. If it is some kind of dairy churn, then perhaps it was a dairy property a dairy farm that they were living on. The other great thing I love about this photograph is if you look on the right hand side, you can see what seems to be the main part of the house, and you can just capture in it that it was clad in chamfer boards. So in my house styles video I did a couple of weeks ago, I talked about chamfer boards, where basically they are overlap boards, but they have what's called a chamfer cut out of the top of them, a little shape cut in the top, and then that lets the boards sit flat over top of each other. When you look at the building on the left hand side, however, it's much rougher, and the fact that it's got a chimney to me says that it was probably the kitchen, because that generally was the main area that would have a fireplace for cooking. And it also fits that it was a lot rougher and that it's separate from the main house, which was very common to reduce the risk of fire and also to prevent the heat and smells from cooking infiltrating the main part of the house. So I just think that's fascinating what's captured in the background of this photo and what it can tell us about houses that were being built around 1885 or before 1885. Number 4. A friend of mine was moving house recently, and they lived at Wavell Heights, and they had bought the house many years ago. And when they were doing some renovation work, they pulled up the lino, and as was quite common, they found that the person who'd laid the lino had put newspapers underneath it. This was a really common practice, to lay newspaper on the bare floorboards and then put the lino over it because it helped give a nice smooth flat finish. They had held onto these newspapers for quite a few years, and knowing how much I loved house history, they offered them to me, and of course, because I'm borderline hoarder when it comes to this kind of stuff, I said heck yes, I'll take them off your hands. And I finally had a chance to look through them this week. The house was built in about 1916 or 1917 by Andrew and Agnes Loney, and it was built under the Workers' Dwellings Scheme, which I've discussed in previous videos. Basically, it was a state government scheme where people could borrow money to construct houses, and it was quite an affordable way of building a house. Now this one's interesting because it's not one of the standard designs that was being offered by the Workers' Dwelling Board. But anyway, I'm not going to go into detail about this house history. So I've been having a great time flicking through these newspapers. They all date from 1929, but there's the Sunday Mail, the Daily Mail, the Telegraph, and Smith's Weekly. So there's a whole range of newspapers that were available in 1929 captured in this little sample. What shows were on in Brisbane in 1929, what was making headlines back then, who was dying, who was being born, all kinds of fascinating information captured in these newspapers. And yes, I know that you can view digitised newspapers on Trove, and I use them all the time. So Queensland newspapers are available digitised up till 1953 on Trove. If you haven't already had a look at them, I highly recommend it, but it is a massive rabbit hole. But it's just not the same as handling these yellowed, old, musty smelling, dirty newspapers. It's so tactile and I absolutely love it. Just, you cannot replicate the feel of handling that original document like that. So yes, I've been having a fantastic time flicking through those. So thank you, Andrew. In the last episode, I told you a little bit about a house I researched which had originally been located on James Street in Fortitude Valley. Now I got up to the part where this house, which was built in 1897 by Michael Lyons, was actually relocated to a block in Moorooka in November 2023. As I mentioned in that episode, the owner wanted to know the history of the house where it was built on James Street, but also wanted to know what the story was with the block in Moorooka as well. It's in the middle of a developed area and built up area, so he wanted to know why it had become a blank block. So I began researching this block of land, and I touched on the subdivision of this land at Moorooka in episode 11, it was, where I talked about how it started as massive tens and hundreds of acres of land blocks, and then they gradually get subdivided down into residential sized allotments. Now, basically the entire western side of this street was bought by the Arnold family. A number of blocks were bought by John Arnold, and the remainder were purchased by his mother, Margaretha. The land then remained in the ownership of that family and their descendants for many, many decades. But John Arnold purchased this block in about 1908, and I think he built on it shortly afterwards, although it was very tricky to tell exactly when a house was first built there. And as you'll see, the style of the house that he built was quite an old style, so it is possible that they also relocated these homes to the land after they bought it because they had previously lived nearby. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Anyway, so John Arnold bought the land, and he was actually christened Johann Arnold. His parents were German, but as was quite common, he later anglicised his name to become John. His brother did the same. He was christened Heinrich Wilhelm, but became Henry William. I have no idea if that's how you pronounce Wilhelm. Helm, I just made that up basically. If you're German, please correct me. My German ancestors would be horrified, I'm sure. And that's actually a little family history research tip right there. If you can't find your family under their names and you know that they were perhaps German or from another country, make sure you search for them under how their names would have been spelt originally. Now, as I mentioned, John and his mum owned the land on the western side of this street, and they both built small cottages on this land. Remarkably, Margaretha's is still there, although it's been extended and modernised, but sadly John's isn't there. So the current owners of this block of land wanted to know what had happened. Now, I looked into it a bit further and undertook some research, and by looking at aerial photographs, which is a resource I use quite often, I tracked down that the house had been there up until 2019. And once I got onto Google Street View, I could work back through the dates, and I found what the house had looked like at that date. And there was also some surviving real estate photographs from around that same time. It was a gorgeous little, what would have been originally a 2-room cottage. As I mentioned, it's quite an old style, and it's something that you would expect to have seen probably earlier, so 1870s, 1880s, that type of thing. But as I mentioned, the first record I can find of the family living on this land is in 1908. So it's possible that it was built in an old style after that time, or they may have relocated these homes from other land they owned nearby. Now, in the 2019 aerial photograph, I could see that part of the roof was missing, and there was some of the sheeting lying around the house, and there was a few bits and pieces lying in the yard. So when I looked into it a bit further, I thought, well, if it's 2019, then any development work should be available to be found on the Brisbane City Council Development Eye website. So I jumped on there and had a look, and sure enough, there was a request to demolish the building because there'd been a fire, and it had a number of photographs that showed what the building looked like after this had happened. And as a result, it had to be demolished because it was deemed structurally unsound. So then I knew what had happened to this house and why the block had ended up vacant, which was very interesting to know. I also uncovered during the research that the house, which was originally on 3 blocks of land, gradually had each block sold off and a house built on either one. So they have since been demolished as well, but you could tell when the land was subdivided off based on the style of these houses, which is always a good thing to look for when you are researching a house. Make sure you check out the houses either side as well and on the rest of the street, so it gives you an idea of the age. Now, what the real estate photographs also showed, and the aerial photographs, was that there was a couple of really fascinating outbuildings in the backyard. One of them was quite large, and I would put money on it having been stables or something like that. It was a really old looking building, and I would imagine it would have been built by John Arnold quite early on in the history of this property. Now, his brother who lived down the road, he ran a dairy farm, and it wouldn't surprise me either if this was part of the farming operations and that they actually consolidated their land and used it all to run cows. But I don't have any proof of that, and sadly those buildings were demolished as well when the house was knocked down. So it's such a shame, because I think they would have told us a lot more about the early history of this land. But the next chapter in this block is that, as I mentioned last time and at the beginning of this, the house, an old cottage, so built in 1897 or thereabouts, was moved from James Street, Fortitude Valley, and placed on this block at Moorooka. The owners had it raised because they planned to build underneath it, and they also planned to renovate it. So this cottage now has a second life in its new location, which is absolutely fantastic, I think, although it's always obviously better to leave a house where it was built. See earlier episode on my rant on relocating houses. But the next best option is to have it relocated and restored rather than demolished. I was lucky enough to visit. The owners invited me over to have a sticky beak around, and it's quite fascinating. It's got a number of original features that still survive inside, and I think it's just going to come up an absolute treat after renovation, and I look forward to seeing it. In my last video, gee, I'm referring to my old videos a lot in this episode, I apologise, but go back and watch them if you haven't already. But in the last episode, I discussed pre-cut timber houses, which were like IKEA house kits that were mailed out to you. And one of the companies that supplied these houses was called Queensland Pastoral Supplies. And as part of researching those homes, I went down this path of uncovering more about this Queensland Pastoral Supplies, QPS. And it was a fascinating history. So it was established in 1919 by Alfred Stutzer Hubers, and it was designed to supply everything required for the man on the land, as the slogan was at the time. Now, they were a huge mail order company, and this was in the days before online shopping, where if you lived in a rural area, you would receive these catalogues in the mail from the suppliers, and then you would be able to look through and decide what you wanted to order, and you would then mail back your order for the goods and payment, and they would be sent out to you, much like online shopping works today. So they supplied everything from the houses, building supplies, hardware, furniture, appliances like gas stoves, everything you could need for the house, but also everything you could need for your farm. So fencing supplies, wire, animal supplies, feed, basically everything you could possibly need, these guys stocked it. It became highly successful, and they're still a registered company today. So an absolutely fascinating company, and I'd love to research them a little bit more. And if anyone happens to have, I know this is a long shot, but if anyone happens to have any old QPS catalogues lying around, particularly if you live on rural properties, I'm sure there's some hoarders out there that never got rid of them. If you have any, please let me know. I'd love to see some photographs of other examples of the business over time. There's a couple of them held at the State Library of Queensland, but they only cover a very small period of time. So I'd love to know how the range that they offered changed over the decades. But yes, I thought they were an absolutely fascinating company, and as I said, they had their fingers in basically every single pie, including selling entire houses in kit form. So absolutely remarkable. Number one, yes, you guessed it, I'm going to refer to things I've discussed in previous episodes. In both the last episode, episode 14, yes, 14, and the previous one, episode 13, I discuss Anzac cottages briefly. And as I mentioned, I need to do probably a whole episode on them by themselves because it's such an interesting history. But as part of looking into this, and I mentioned this as when I was talking about the history of the Golden Casket Lottery and the things it funded, part of what this scheme also funded was the construction of homes for soldiers who came back from the First World War suffering from tuberculosis. Now, tuberculosis is an infection that mainly affects the lungs, and it's caused by Mycobacterium tuberculosis. It was called consumption in the old days because people physically appear to fade away. So it's as if their body is being consumed from within. And if you've ever watched any old movies, normally, you know, they're coughing up a lung and they're coughing, and then the shot goes to their handkerchief and it's covered in blood, and you know that they're destined to die. Now, I don't mean to make light of it. It was a horrible disease, and it was one of the #1 killers of people in Australia in the late 19th and earlier 20th century. Now today it's treated easily with antibiotics, although would you believe cases of TB are actually increasing in America at the moment, which is a little bit terrifying, to be honest. But back during and immediately after the First World War, the only treatment was isolation, so keeping these people suffering this apart from others so that they couldn't transmit the disease onto them, and also fresh air. And as a result of this, a number of what were generally called sanatoriums were established all over the place. They were usually located somewhere where the climate was considered to be particularly suitable for recuperation. In 1907, an incredibly enterprising woman, Margaret Ellison, had established a private TB clinic out at Kayumba, which is right near Stanthorpe, which is basically on the New South Wales Queensland border. And she had established this private clinic for the treatment of people suffering from tuberculosis. However, during the First World War, she started to get sent returned soldiers who were suffering, or returned servicemen who were suffering from tuberculosis as well. Eventually, the number of returned servicemen that were being treated at this sanatorium continued to increase, and eventually it actually became an official military hospital and was run by the Commonwealth government. There's some fantastic photographs of the sanatorium that survive from different dates. And what's really cool about these is they not only show the buildings, but they show some of the patients that were being treated there. And one of the ways that they treated tuberculosis patients, and this was common across all different hospitals and all over the world, was the fresh air and outdoors. So a lot of tuberculosis wards were actually open to the elements or had big open verandas where patients could be wheeled out on and they would get the sunlight and the fresh air. So there was actually an open air ward like this at the Royal Brisbane Hospital for a period as well. There's also fabulous photographs of some of the nursing staff that work there, which is wonderful to have because they were really the unsung heroes in this story, looking after these returned servicemen and nursing a lot of them back to health. You can also see from some of the photos that it was extended over the years and a number of other buildings were added to the original one, and it became quite a big military hospital, as I mentioned. Sadly, none of it remains anymore, although I think I did read on one of the websites that some of the buildings had been moved to become farm buildings on different properties, so maybe we could track them down if you feel like doing some sleuthing. So yes, just an incredible place to learn about, and like I've said before, I never know what I'm going to stumble across in my research or where it's going to lead me, but this was just one of those incredible places that I never would have found otherwise, and I'm super glad I stumbled across. I hope you enjoyed hearing those top 5 interesting discoveries from my house history research. And if you haven't already, please like and subscribe. I really appreciate it. And I'll see you next time.